I was asked to speak on the topic of solving climate and specifically the need for zero carbon on-demand power, dispatchable power, firm power, whatever you want to call it, something that's not intermittent on the system. And so I'm going to share with you some findings. And this is sort of the basis on which my organization came to the conclusion that CCS and advanced nuclear were going to be really important parts of solving the climate equation. Stabilizing climate means zero emissions, and we won't go into the physics of that, but basically carbon, once emitted, stays in the atmosphere essentially forever in a human time scale. So if we're actually going to manage temperature down, we've really got to cut off the carbon emissions entirely. Otherwise, the bathtub keeps filling up and it overflows at some point. So turning off the spigot is the only way to go on this. Second, and this is the thrust of my talk, zero carbon on-demand power sources will be needed. Failure to deploy them could lead us to decarbonization dead ends where we stall out somewhere maybe around 50 or 60% reductions instead of getting to zero. So we need to take action today to create better, cheaper, on-demand zero carbon options. So the first point is simply that if you want to get to zero, or if you want to get to a world climate that's within the targets that the international community has adopted, the most recent is the Paris Agreement of December 2015, 195 nations gelled around the goal of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and aspired further to 1.5 degrees. The pathway to get there, and this is taken from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's work in this area, is this lower path. You can see it basically glides down to about zero, or, sort of somewhat after mid-century, and that's sort of in that sort of 0.9 to 2.3 degree C range. Now, we all know the models, are squishy to some extent, but this is at least the current scientific consensus of the modeling community. So the point here really is that a 50% cut's not going to do it. A 50% cut keeps you at a world that's about 3 degrees warmer. Really, if you're going to manage in that 2 degree parameter, you need to be going down to zero fairly soon. Now, you know this already. I'll just recap a couple of key points. So we've got to go to zero at the same time that we are going to be substantially increasing energy consumption. This is from the latest BP Energy Outlook, but you can see from 2016 forward, we're looking at about another 50% increase in demand. This is at the same time that we are actually increasing energy efficiency. So this growth is net of very significant improvements over the next decade in the amount of work we get out of every kilowatt hour. Grid electricity will comprise a growing share of global energy consumption. And you can see this on the right. This is again from BP Energy Outlook. In about 2014, we're at about 42% of total primary energy demand is electricity. And as you can see, that's going to creep upward as economies, particularly in the developing world, electrify and we move from primary fuels to electricity. There is a notion out there that maybe the developing world will leapfrog the grid and we will have distributed generation that will disrupt the central grid model. We've kind of looked at that question, and our conclusion, it's kind of hard to read here, but this is expected evolution of global electrification. Here's where we are today, where about 80% of households in the world are on grid right now. We've commissioned some work, this is an early look, that suggests that kind of percentage will hold, and in fact, the percentage of world households connected to the grid will actually increase. So we expect between grid coming to the villages and people in the villages moving to cities or peri-urban areas, we expect this to be a very gridded world. Now, this is the irresistible force in the immovable object, right? We've got to get to zero carbon. At the same time, we've got to grow the energy supply by at least 50% over the next couple decades. The projections for mid-century might be something more like a doubling. So The sort of common sense wisdom on this would be exemplified from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment report from 2014 on mitigation. And it's, basically an all of the above message. No single mitigation option in the energy supply sector will be sufficient to get to that zero mark. Achieving deep cuts in emissions will require more intensive use of low greenhouse gas technologies such as renewable energy, nuclear energy, and CCS. So this is not the coal industry speaking. This is not the nuclear industry speaking. This is not the renewables industry speaking. These are the folks who sat around for 2 or 3 years and just looked at all the options. And this is a good example of an output from the IPCC. This is sort of a mid-range estimate for a kind of a scenario, you might say, for getting to zero over a period of decades. And what's kind of interesting is, again, you see very high solar contributions, very high wind contributions, but gas with CCS and coal with CCS are also very substantial, as well as nuclear. So this is kind of the sort of balanced scenarios that you tend to see coming out of these modeling exercises. Another example is the United Nations Sustainable Solutions Network pulled together the large emitting countries about 2 years ago and looked at these sort of 80% plus carbon reduction scenarios. In this report you can find online. And what's kind of interesting, this is each country's team coming back with their 80% reduction scenario. And what's kind of interesting is you can see that the gray, this plot is percentage of grid electricity supplied by various sources. The gray here is fossil CCS, and the blue is nuclear. So you can see for most of the countries, nuclear and fossil CCS play a fairly large role. And again, this is the United Nations, very, where the Framework Convention on Climate Change is nested. The thrust of this, and I think why I was asked to come speak today, is I think Dave Moeller had seen a talk I'd given on some of the research we've had underway now for a couple of years. And again, this is kind of going to describe how we got to the conclusions we did and why we worked so hard on the firm energy options. There is a view out there, and it's not fringe. It's a pretty mainstream view, I think, in the media, that pretty much we can do this zero carbon scenario with weather-dependent renewables like solar and wind. Hydro sometimes discussed, sometimes biomass is discussed, and we can get into that in the Q&A. But the dominant kind of view on this, I think it would be fair to say, from certainly a lot of my colleagues, is that wind, solar, batteries, and energy efficiency will pretty much get us to zero. And we started poking at that a little bit, being an analytically minded group a couple years ago, and started looking at the studies out there and doing some of our own analysis. Here are the high-level conclusions, and then I'll do a deeper dive. The first conclusion is that, I guess, the one way to summarize this would be high variable renewable energy systems, I'll call them VRE systems, are technically feasible, but they're still going to require significant dispatchable backup capacity, most likely. That dispatchable backup capacity that needs to maintain reliability will add substantially to the cost of decarbonization. The most interesting finding from our work is that low-cost storage doesn't fundamentally change this conclusion. I think there is a view out there that if we can just get storage right, then we've got intermittency solved, and I'll describe why we don't think that's true. Transmission, expansion, interconnection, expanding the area over which your supply is managed can help. Demand response, curtailment can help, but again, we don't see those fundamentally changing the first two conclusions, and I will show you some numbers on that. The fundamental dynamic that drives this problem of why storage won't solve, won't deal with the intermittency problem sufficiently, is that weather dependency is a seasonal, monthly, and weekly phenomenon. It's not a daily phenomenon. So we have weeks of wind drought, we have weeks of sun drought, not all in all parts of the world. The equator does pretty well on sun on most days. It's pretty reliable. But as you get into the temperate zones of the world where most people live, we get these fluctuations. I'll show you some examples from the northern latitudes. So the transmission and storage is not going to deal with those weekly variations. High variable renewable energy systems also tend to have very big physical footprints, which may not be buildable or acceptable, and I'll show you some illustrations of that. So the ultimate conclusion is that some kind of zero carbon baseload and dispatchable capacity, nuclear, decarbonized fossil, hamsters in a cage, whatever it is. I'm not going to really be specific about that today. That's the discussion for the rest of the day. But my general point is that something that is that is dispatchable and can be tuned up and down is going to be really important to deep carbon reductions that we need. I'm going to show you some original analysis we did on Germany. Germany, of course, is the iconic example of sort of trying to do this on take this approach of dependency on weather-dependent renewables. So the Energiewende, or the energy turn as it's called, has several elements. The current German policy, first of all, is for an 80% greenhouse gas reduction below 1990 by 2050, 80% renewable electricity by 2050, not all wind and solar, but mostly wind and solar. They have a certain amount of hydro and biomass on the system now. They want to drop electricity demand 25% over that time period, and then an accelerated nuclear phase out by 2022, which is well underway right now. So we just tried to take a look at what that future looks like. What does the system look like? So we took the existing data that we had on wind and solar output in Germany. We lowered demand. This is the month of January 2050. I'll show you October in a minute. But this is megawatts. This is daily, peak demand and so forth in blue. The surplus generation is in brown. That is when the wind and solar are exceeding demand, and the yellow areas are when wind and solar production is lower than demand, and so you need something to fill that gap. So this is at an 80% renewable number. That is, on an annual basis, 80% of the energy is coming from renewables. We've taken the nuclear out of the system. We've dropped demand by 25%. And we just kind of ran the numbers out, and what you get is something like a surplus of 5.4 million megawatt hours during that month, but your balancing requirement is about 8.9 million megawatt hours, so you're short that month. And the consequence of that is by the time you get to this point in the month, you need something like 36 gigawatts of conventional capacity to get through the rest of the month. And that's on a peak demand, notice somewhere in the 50 gigawatt range. So you don't escape the problem. You can have all the storage you want to capture this excess, but it's still not going to fill the deficit. That's one of the better months. This is the worst month. And of course, if you know electric systems, you know you have to plan for the worst month, right? To make sure that the capacity is there. This is October 2050, when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine very much in Germany. And same methodology, daily demand, surplus. You can see the surplus is much sparser that month, and you run out of stored energy much more quickly. So there you have a 900,000 megawatt hour surplus, but an 11 million megawatt hour deficit. So you need something like 43 gigawatts of conventional capacity against a peak demand of 50. So you're really not avoiding the need for that dispatchable capacity. You're running two systems side by side, essentially, and that has obvious cost implications. It also has size implications. One of the interesting things about looking at this case study was that the high renewable 80% scenario has a lot of renewables in it. That's the wind and PV, but it also has a large conventional system. In fact, the conventional system is almost the same size as a conventional system without renewables. So again, this makes the point that you have kind of a shadow system that you have to build to actually keep the lights on. So again, this is Elon Musk and his Powerwall. It is often suggested that storage will solve this problem, that we can just, if we buy enough Powerwalls, we'll be fine. That is not what our analysis suggests. What we did was to look at what the impact was of perfect storage, that is completely frictionless storage with no waste. Every kilowatt hour captured is a kilowatt hour later used. And again, German numbers. This is monthly peak demand over the year, and that's in blue. And then that's the amount of capacity you need with perfect storage. So you can see in some months like July, it does kind of make a difference. You've reduced your standby capacity significantly, but again, in months like October, not so much, or February. So the point here is that storage buys you something, and again, this is a lot of storage. We'll get to that in a minute, but it really doesn't displace the need for this firm capacity. Again, the lesson here is storage can help address daily fluctuations, but doesn't solve multi-week and seasonal variation in wind and solar availability. A good example of this is a plot of German solar variability. This is January in blue, and that's June in orange. And this is a monthly, sequence. And as you can see, the not only in January do you get pretty significant fluctuations, but the inter-seasonal variation is very high, by a factor of something like 3 to 1. So again, it's the bad months that are going to kill you. Similarly, if we look at wind in Germany over the course of a year, you can see these examples of multi-week, very low periods of production, and then you get these spikes. And again, the problem here is that storage can ride you through, a few days, but it will not get you through these multiple weeks. Another, just switching gears for a second, we also did some similar analysis of California, and this is actually annual, so this is January, that is December. And as it happens in California, both wind and solar tend to peak in the summer months. So you ride along here for the first few months of the year and you have almost no surplus, and then all of a sudden you start to accumulate an enormous amount of surplus. And then as you get into the fall, you need to use that surplus. So what would it mean to actually deal with that amount of surplus with storage? It would mean something like 1.1 billion Tesla Powerwalls, 29 per capita, so think of that's like a household of 4 would have 30 times 4, 120 Tesla Powerwalls. That would be about $7 trillion at current prices. Another way to do this would just be about 200 of the largest pump storage facilities in the world put in California. We asked one of our hydrologist friends, and he said, well, yeah, if you filled the Central Valley and turn it into pumped hydro, you probably could do this. I mean, I'm being a little bit, critical here of some of these scenarios. I think the point is that you could do this. I mean, you could decide that this is where you wanted to go with this, but is it likely that we're going to make this kind of expenditure and undertake that kind of infrastructure is kind of the question. Transmission doesn't seem to solve the problem either fully. It can help. But across continental scales, at least, there is very high correlation on wind and solar on any given day. This actually is this is actually taken from the German government's study of this topic. And what you see here is the month of May. There's 1st of May, there's May 31st. This is wind capacity factors, that is the percentage of installed wind capacity that's actually producing on any given day. Different spatial scales, that's Europe, that's kind of Northwest Europe, that's Germany, that's Bavaria, and then that's, can't remember what that area is, but in any event, what you see is, there's some difference, there is some anti-correlation, but there's a lot of parts of the month where things line up actually pretty substantially. Weather patterns tend to be quite similar over, 1,000 1,000-mile, 2,000-mile scales. So the point is transmission can help spread around the risk and the wind, but the wind is not always blowing somewhere. Sometimes the wind is not blowing everywhere. And sometimes that's a matter of days. I mean, you can see these troughs, again, you can see these multi-day troughs, for example, that are European-wide. Demand response is another solution that people look to deal with this level of intermittency. But again, the question comes back, for what period of time? And so the question is, can substantial loads like industrial processes, heating and cooling, or electric vehicle charging be deferred over weeks or months? That's the question. And will major industrial capital investments be made to operate only at low capacity factors, at times when the wind and sun surpluses are available? So people, for example, hypothesize that we will use off-peak wind production at night to drive electrolysis to create hydrogen, and then we'll put the hydrogen in turbines when we need it, when we have no wind. But again, you've just moved the intermittency problem from the grid over to the electrolysis plant, because the electrolysis plant is going to operate at very low capacity factor. So what do the economics of that begin to look like? It's a good question. If we look at like Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, or it's no longer PJM, I guess, it's much bigger than that. But just as an example, so PJM is considered one of the big success stories on demand response. But if you actually look at the average amount of curtailment over this period of time, the average annual total hours curtailed are 14 hours out of 8,760. The average curtailment is 4 times a year. Average duration, 3.5 hours. Average curtailment is about 1% of peak. So is it really reasonable to extrapolate from those sort of very episodic curtailments to say we can run a system based on backing people off on demand for weeks? It's at least a reasonable question. So I showed you some of our original analysis. There's a lot of other analyses around out there that have very similar conclusions. This is, again, back to the United Nations Sustainable Solutions Network, Deep Decarbonization Study of the U.S. What you see here is a sort of a system. They modeled some ideal systems. This is a mixed system with CCS, nuclear, and renewables. This is the high renewables scenario. That's a high nuclear scenario. That's a high CCS scenario. And this is, dollars per year to run the system. And you can see that this is the zero line, so you can see that the high renewables system, for the reasons that we've just gone through, which is the need for this redundant capacity, are something like, a 50% higher cost than a more balanced system. Another example, recently the UK Energy Research Partnership looked at this question and kind of came up with basically the same conclusion, even acknowledging the possible contribution of demand-side management, interconnections, and storage to firming up weather-dependent renewables. A deep decarbonization of the grid will need a significant penetration of zero-carbon firm capacity. So I'm going to kind of conclude by, talking a little bit about size of system and plausibility of these systems. This is a paper which has received a lot of attention by Mark Jacobson and his colleagues at Stanford University, 100% clean and renewable wind, water, and sunlight, the 100% renewable scenario. It's gotten a lot of media attention. And it's kind of interesting when you kind of peel back the onion and you say, what does that kind of system look like at 100%? So the peak demand for the U.S. in that scenario is about 1.5 terawatts. And the capacity required is about 5.8 terawatts. So again, this gets to the point that you got to build a lot of low capacity factor capacity, plus you need something else to actually stabilize the system. What does that mean in real terms? So I just took their tables and translated them into units that people might understand. So we start with 1,670 offshore wind farms, each the size of Cape Wind, or 72 per coastal state. About 50 Tehachapi-sized wind farms onshore for every state, 27 gigawatts of wave machines, which of course none exist today, 227 gigawatts of concentrated solar plants, or if you followed the Ivanpah project in In California, that's about 10 Ivanpahs per state, and then another 7 per state just for storage, not for generation. About 2.3 terawatts of central solar PV. Again, I mean, think about scale. The entire U.S. electric system is 1 terawatt. So 2.5 times the current U.S. electric system in central solar PV. Another 469 gigawatts, or 1.5 times the size of the U.S. coal fleet, of solar thermal storage. And then to make the whole system balance, you need an enormous amount of storage, flexible load, in fact, something like 1 terawatt of storage. So, the question isn't, can this be technically accomplished? With enough money and enough engineering, I think you can pretty much do anything. Probably. The question is, do you want to bet the planet that we're going to do this? And I would say probably not. So just to conclude, and I know we're going to have some discussion this afternoon about, how do we move the zero carbon options forward? Because I can't sit here today and tell you that CCS is a widely implemented solution or that advanced nuclear is a widely implemented solution, right? I mean, we're stalled on both. So we have a couple of ideas about that just to throw into the mix here. One is clearly we need aggressive RD&D and early deployment policies to move forward the cost, move down the cost curve and improve performance and innovation. Dispatchable renewables, storage, CCS and advanced nuclear examples. A good example of a technology that's kind of interesting is net power. For those of you who haven't been following, is a gas-based technology. It's an advanced power cycle that's highly efficient, that uses CO2 as a working fluid in the turbine, which means you're getting the benefit of having done the separation and compression of the CO2 already. Their claim is that they can do gas power at something close, with zero carbon, that is with CCS, at something close to the cost of a conventional gas turbine. So if they're, we'll see. They just did a groundbreaking on their 50 megawatt demonstration in Texas, and we'll see. They believe that this same power cycle is usable for coal. So we're in early days on this. Second, zero carbon capacity procurement incentives. Something like if we began to do long-run zero carbon capacity market auctions, incentives for procurement of long-run firm zero carbon capacity at the state or federal level, in generation-regulated jurisdictions where we're still doing resource planning, some kind of procurement adders for capacity and dispatchability value. If we look at some places like California, where they're beginning to do special procurements of things like storage, that in principle should be applicable to technologies like CCS, or for that matter, advanced nuclear. And then finally, making clean energy policies technology neutral. Policies to consider might include allowing nuclear and CCS to participate in state clean energy or RPS programs, technology neutral federal tax incentives such as the ITC and PTC. And I know we're going to have a longer discussion about that this afternoon. If you're interested in a deeper dive on some of these principles, we held a workshop last summer. The results of the workshop are summarized at this website, and you can do a deeper dive there.